When God dies, what becomes of man?
Wow. Starting right out of the gate with the heavy stuff.
Yeah, well, think about the sheer weight of that idea for a second.
Yeah.
We're not just talking about, a theological debate
Right.
or a shift in weekend attendance at church. We're talking about the complete collapse of an entire foundation of meaning.
Absolutely.
When the ultimate authority figure of the universe is just removed from the equation, what happens to our sense of right and wrong?
And what happens to our purpose?
Exactly. That profound, deeply unsettling question is the bedrock of what we are exploring today. Welcome to the Deep Dive.
Glad to be here.
Today, we are unpacking the philosophical confrontation between two of the 19th century's most brilliant, intense, and unyielding minds.
Fyodor Dostoevsky and Friedrich Nietzsche.
Yes. These are two giants of human thought who looked at the exact same shifting world, asked that exact same terrifying question we just posed, and arrived at answers that are so fundamentally opposed.
So radically different.
Yeah, that they are still fighting it out in our culture today.
It really is one of the most vital intellectual collisions in modern history. And what makes this so compelling, at least to me, is that neither of these men treated this as an abstract academic puzzle.
Right. It wasn't just some paper they were writing for a university office.
No, for them, this was quite literally a matter of life and death for the human soul. On one side, we have Dostoevsky, a Russian novelist who had actually faced a firing squad.
Which is just wild to think about.
He endured the Siberian gulag, and he looked at the prospect of a world without God with genuine dread. He believed that without a transcendent divine anchor, humanity would just inevitably tear itself apart.
Descend into total moral chaos.
Exactly. And then standing in direct opposition is Nietzsche, the solitary, brilliant German philologist. He looks the exact same fading away of the divine, and he doesn't see chaos or tragedy at all.
What does he see?
He sees the ultimate liberation. For him, the death of God is humanity's greatest opportunity to finally grow up, to shed the comforting illusions of childhood and forge a new destiny.
I think it is so important to establish right away for you, the listener, that we're not just doing a historical retrospective here. We're not dusting off old books.
Not at all.
The ideas these two men fought over are the exact same ideas you and I wrestle with every single day. Our modern anxieties, our search for meaning, our political polarizations.
Our debates over what is actually true versus what is just a social construct.
Yes, all of it is rooted in this 19th century clash. So, how did we get here? Let's look at the atmosphere they were living in, because before they completely diverged and basically went to war with each other philosophically, they actually started from the exact same diagnosis of the world.
They did. To understand them, you really have to mentally place yourself in late 19th century Europe. This was a society undergoing an unprecedented seismic transformation.
A total paradigm shift.
Dostoevsky and Nietzsche, despite living completely different lives and having wildly different temperaments, both looked around and diagnosed a threefold crisis emerging in the modern age.
Let's break that down. The first pillar of this crisis was religion. Right.
Yes, the religious narrative was rapidly losing its absolute authority. For centuries, the church had the final say on the nature of reality, the origin of the world, human purpose. But that grip was slipping fast.
Right. And it was slipping because of the second part of their diagnosis. Science was actively replacing metaphysics.
Exactly.
And we're not just talking about people learning, how the digestive system works or discovering new elements. We're talking about the scientific method stepping up as the new exclusive arbiter of truth.
It was the dawn of this mechanistic view of the universe.
Where everything could supposedly be measured, quantified, and solved.
And that leads directly to the third and probably most dangerous part of the crisis. Because the religious foundation was crumbling and because science deals with what is rather than what ought to be.
Morality was suddenly left floating in the void.
It had lost its foundational anchor.
That is a staggering shift for a civilization to undergo. Imagine living in a culture where for thousands of years, the bedrock of everything was answered by a unified religious framework.
Why the sun rises, why you should be a good neighbor, what happens when you die.
Right, the very definition of a meaningful life. And then, seemingly overnight in the grand scheme of history, that foundation just begins to dissolve. Both thinkers named this void, but they articulated it in ways that really highlight their upcoming divergence.
Nietzsche coined a phrase that is arguably one of the most famous in all of philosophy.
The death of God.
Yes. And it's crucial to understand what he meant by that. When Nietzsche proclaims that God is dead, he isn't talking about a literal assassination in the heavens.
Making a sociological observation.
Profoundly so. And a psychological one. He is pointing out that the idea of God has lost its power to act as the organizing principle of human society. The belief is no longer the default, unshakable reality.
Right.
And his warning is that because the belief is fading, the entire moral structure built on top of it, our values, our laws, our concept of human rights, is eventually going to collapse, even if we don't realize it yet.
I always think of it as the Wile E. Coyote effect.
Oh, that's a perfect analogy.
Right. Society has run off the edge of the cliff, and we are still pedaling our legs in midair, not realizing the ground is gone.
Exactly. We haven't looked down yet.
Now, Dostoevsky saw that exact same collapse happening, but his articulation of it cuts straight to the moral terror of the situation. He captures the fear that when God disappears, everything becomes permitted.
That phrase is the heartbeat of Dostoevsky's anxiety. If there is no ultimate judge, no absolute standard of right and wrong woven into the fabric of reality, then who is to say what is good and what is evil?
It just becomes subjective.
Morality ceases to be a universal truth and just becomes a matter of opinion. Or, far more dangerously, it becomes a matter of power. Whoever has the strength to enforce their opinion gets to define what is good.
And what fascinates me about this moment in history is how the rest of the intellectual world reacted. Because society didn't just sit around grieving the loss of religious certainty.
Not at all.
You had the Enlightenment thinkers coming along, brimming with optimism, saying, hey, don't worry, we don't need the old myths. We have a much better replacement. Science plus reason equals a perfect society.
They genuinely believed they could build a rational utopia.
They thought we could just calculate our way to human flourishing. And yet, both Dostoevsky and Nietzsche absolutely despised this idea.
They found it incredibly naive and, quite frankly, dangerous. The Enlightenment thinkers treated human beings as though we were merely complex math equations.
Like we're just inputs and outputs.
Right. Their operating theory was that if you just educate everyone, eradicate poverty, and organize society according to scientific, rational principles, everyone will naturally act in their own rational best interest.
The result would be permanent peace, harmony, and progress.
But Nietzsche and Dostoevsky looked at that proposition and scoffed, because they fundamentally understood something that the utopian thinkers were desperately trying to ignore.
That human nature is profoundly, deeply irrational.
We are not perfectly logical creatures.
It's a fundamental misunderstanding of what we are. It's like trying to tell someone who is wildly in love or blindingly jealous to just consult a spreadsheet to optimize their emotional response.
It doesn't work.
We are not robots operating on logic boards. And this shared realization provides an incredible bridge into how they view the psychology of the human mind. In fact, there's a fascinating historical footnote here. Nietzsche, who was notoriously critical of almost everyone.
He handed out compliments very rarely.
Very rarely. But he actually had profound praise for Dostoevsky. He referred to him as the only psychologist from whom he had something to learn.
It is a remarkable admission from a man who prided himself on tearing down the idols of his time. Nietzsche certainly didn't agree with Dostoevsky's religious convictions, but he recognized a kindred spirit in Dostoevsky's unmatched, almost forensic understanding of the dark, irrational depths of human motivation.
He was really ahead of his time.
Long before Sigmund Freud was mapping the id and the ego, Dostoevsky was spelunking into the unconscious. He was exploring how resentment, spite, guilt, the desire to dominate, and even the subconscious desire to suffer actually drive human behavior far more effectively than logic or reason ever could.
To really make this concrete, we have to look at one of Dostoevsky's most brilliant creations. We were talking about the unnamed narrator from his novella, Notes from Underground.
The Underground in Man.
Yes. If you haven't encountered this book, the main character is deeply uncomfortable to spend time with. He is bitter, spiteful, hypocritical, and agonizingly self-aware.
He is basically the anatomy of modern consciousness.
He is a walking prophecy of modern psychological conflict. And if we look at his core traits, they completely obliterate the Enlightenment's dream of the rational human. First off, he harbors an intense hatred for the idea of a rational utopia.
He absolutely loathes it. The utopian thinkers of Dostoevsky's time used the metaphor of a crystal palace. A massive, flawlessly designed structure of glass and steel where everything is perfect, predictable, and mathematically harmonious.
Sounds like a nightmare to him.
The Underground Man looks at this vision of a perfectly organized society where every human need is calculated and met, and he recoils in horror. He argues that even if you could build this perfect crystal palace, humans would inevitably smash the glass to pieces,
Why? Just for the sake of it.
simply to prove that they are human beings with free will, and not just piano keys being played by the laws of physics. They would invite chaos into paradise just to assert their own agency.
That is such a profound insight. We would rather be miserable and free than perfectly comfortable cogs in a machine. And that leads directly to the underground man's second core trait, which I think is where Dostoevsky's genius is most uncomfortable.
His tendency to actively sabotage his own happiness.
Dostoevsky masterfully shows that humans will purposely make themselves miserable just to feel like they are the ones pulling the strings.
Exactly. The underground man even talks about a toothache. He talks about how a person will moan and complain about a toothache, not just because it hurts, but because there is a perverse pleasure in inflicting their pain on everyone else in the house.
Controlling the atmosphere through their suffering.
It is a rebellion against the natural laws of pain and comfort.
We see this all the time today. I mean, think about your own life sitting there listening to this. Has you ever been in a perfectly healthy, peaceful relationship, but the peace felt almost suffocating, so you picked a fight just to introduce some friction?
Or think about procrastination.
Exactly. You know a project is due. You know that waiting until the night before will cause you immense stress and anxiety, and yet you actively rebel against the rational structure of a deadline.
Causing your own suffering just to feel a sense of autonomy over your time.
Or doom scrolling at 3 in the morning when you know you need to sleep. That is the underground man. We know exactly what is in our rational best interest, and we sprint in the opposite direction.
It is the perfect modern equivalent. We are deeply contradictory creatures. Dostoevsky uses the underground man to completely dismantle the Socratic idea that to know the good is to do the good.
We often know exactly what is good for us, and we reject it out of spite.
This psychological realism is precisely what Nietzsche respected so deeply. It validated his own conviction that human behavior is propelled by primal, chaotic forces that the intellect can barely contain, let alone control.
But if human nature is truly this irrational, this rebellious, and this complex, that fundamentally breaks the Enlightenment's promise, and if that promise is broken and God is out of the picture and there is no ultimate authority, what actually keeps us from just making up our own rules?
That is the big question.
What happens when an individual decides to push the boundaries of this new godless reality? Dostoevsky actually ran a thought experiment on this very question in his masterpiece, Crime and Punishment, through the character of Raskolnikov.
Raskolnikov is one of the most vital characters in all of literature for understanding this philosophical transition. He is an impoverished, brilliant former student living in St. Petersburg, and he develops a chillingly rational theory.
He divides humanity into two categories. Right.
Yes, the ordinary and the extraordinary. Ordinary people, in his view, are the herd. Their purpose is to obey the laws, be submissive, reproduce, and keep society functioning.
And the extraordinary.
The extraordinary people, the visionaries, the Napoleons of history, the great disruptors, they possess an absolute right to step over moral boundaries if it serves their higher purpose.
He treats morality like a speed limit that only applies to the slow cars.
That's a great way to put it.
And he decides to test this theory by murdering a cynical, abusive pawnbroker. He runs the math in his head. She is a terrible person hoarding money. He's a brilliant young man who could use that money to do great things for humanity.
Therefore, killing her isn't actually a crime.
It is a mathematical correction. He convinces himself that the traditional rules of good and evil simply do not apply to someone of his intellectual caliber.
What is genuinely astonishing about Raskolnikov's theory is how it serves as a proto-version of Nietzsche's most famous concept. If you read Raskolnikov's essay on the extraordinary man purely on paper, it reads like a rough draft of Nietzsche's idea of the Übermensch, or the Superman.
Let's pause there for a second, because the term Übermensch carries a lot of baggage. How exactly does Nietzsche define it, and how does it map onto Raskolnikov?
Nietzsche's Übermensch is essentially his vision for the future of humanity, or at least for the exceptional individuals who will lead it. The Übermensch is the person who has completely overcome the old, dead moralities of the past.
Specifically Christian morality.
Right, which Nietzsche saw as weak and subservient. The Übermensch doesn't look up to the sky for a god to hand down commandments, nor do they look around at society for approval. They become the creators of their own values.
They transcend the conventional binary notions of good and evil to forge a totally new path.
They take the raw, chaotic material of their lives and sculpt it into something magnificent through the sheer force of their will.
Okay, but I have to play devil's advocate here. If Raskolnikov's murder maps onto Nietzsche's theory, is Nietzsche genuinely advocating that great people should just go around murdering pawnbrokers if they feel like it? Is it just a license for psychopathy?
That is a crucial distinction to make. No, Nietzsche is not advocating for petty murder. His concept of overcoming morality is much more about internal psychological and cultural mastery than it is about violent criminality.
So it's more about intellectual and spiritual elevation.
The Übermensch destroys old values to create new, life-affirming ones. However, Dostoevsky's point in Crime and Punishment is precisely that when you tell humans they can transcend morality, it inevitably bleeds into violence.
Because we aren't purely intellectual beings.
Exactly. Dostoevsky forces the theory out of the armchair and into the messy, bloody reality of human action.
And this is where the great divergence happens. They both conceptualize this extraordinary individual stepping beyond the moral law, but they violently disagree on what actually happens to the human soul when it tries to live that way.
They do.
Nietzsche champions this transcendence. He essentially says, yes, break the old tablets of morality. Overcome the guilt, become the Übermensch. But Dostoevsky uses Raskolnikov to demonstrate the devastating psychological toll of actually attempting to live beyond good and evil.
Dostoevsky tests the theory, and the result is catastrophic. Raskolnikov commits the murder. He tries to be the extraordinary man, and almost immediately, his entire psychological architecture collapses.
He falls apart.
He doesn't become a liberated Superman. He becomes a shattered, paranoid wreck. He is plagued by fever dreams, intense isolation, and a spiritual agony that he cannot rationalize away.
Dostoevsky is making a profound argument here. He believed that the human conscience is not merely a social construct that we can philosophize our way out of.
It is wired into us at a biological and spiritual level.
It's like gravity. You can stand on the edge of a building and declare that you are an extraordinary individual who is no longer bound by the oppressive laws of physics. You can write a brilliant essay about it. But the moment you jump, the pavement is still going to win.
The physical laws assert themselves.
Right. Dostoevsky is saying the moral law is just as real and just as unforgiving as gravity. When you sever yourself from it, you don't ascend, you fall, and you sever yourself from the rest of humanity.
That is a beautiful analogy. And Nietzsche's response to that fall would essentially be, you only hit the pavement because you haven't yet learned how to fly.
Interesting.
Nietzsche would look at Raskolnikov's guilt and say that it proves Raskolnikov wasn't actually an Übermensch. He was still infected by the old Christian morality of guilt and pity.
So for Nietzsche, the failure isn't the attempt itself.
For Nietzsche, the failure is not being strong enough to carry it through.
Which brings us to a massive crossroad. Because what we are really talking about here is freedom. Total unanchored freedom. And that takes us into some of the most emotionally heavy and complex territory we have to cover. The burden of freedom and the problem of suffering.
It's the core of the existential dilemma.
Let's start with freedom. In our modern culture, we treat freedom as an absolute, unquestionable good. Everyone wants to be free. But Dostoevsky saw freedom, true, absolute moral freedom, as a terrifying, almost unbearable gift.
He explored this most profoundly in his final and arguably greatest novel, The Brothers Karamazov. Embedded within that novel is a famous parable called The Grand Inquisitor.
It is incredible.
It is widely considered one of the greatest pieces of literature ever written. The premise is striking. Jesus Christ returns to earth, not in glory, but quietly, during the height of the Spanish Inquisition.
He performs a few miracles, the people recognize him, and immediately the Grand Inquisitor, the head of the church, has him arrested and thrown in a dungeon.
The audacity of that scene is incredible. The head of the church arresting Christ.
And the monologue the Inquisitor delivers in that cell is staggering. He basically tells Christ, you messed up. You misunderstood human nature. You gave humans the ultimate freedom to choose between good and evil. And that was a terrible, cruel mistake.
The Inquisitor's argument is that freedom is too painful. It causes too much anxiety. When faced with the infinite abyss of choice and the responsibility that comes with it, humans don't feel liberated, they feel paralyzed.
They can't handle it.
The Inquisitor argues that what the vast majority of people actually crave is not freedom, but security. They want someone, anyone, to tell them what to do, what to believe, and how to live.
So they can be relieved of the terrifying burden of figuring it out themselves.
Exactly. The Inquisitor claims that the Church has actually corrected Christ's work by taking away human freedom and replacing it with miracle, mystery, and authority, thereby giving people the comforting illusion of happiness.
It is a devastating critique. The inquisitor is saying, we have given them bread, and we have taken their freedom, and they love us for it. Dostoevsky is warning us that if we abandon the structure of genuine faith and the difficult freedom it requires, we won't evolve into strong, independent freethinkers.
We will inevitably hand our freedom over to the first authoritarian power that promises to take away our existential anxiety and keep our bellies full.
It is a warning about the human desire for subjugation. Now, Nietzsche's reaction to this dynamic is entirely different, though he actually agrees with the core premise.
That's the fascinating part. Nietzsche entirely agrees that freedom is a terrifying, crushing burden. He agrees that the vast majority of people, what he unapologetically refers to as the herd, cannot handle it.
They will always seek out the comfort of conformity.
Whether that is religion, nationalism, or mindless consumerism. But Nietzsche's conclusion isn't to pity the herd or to advocate for a return to traditional faith. His conclusion is that true freedom is an elite achievement, reserved only for those incredibly rare, exceptional individuals who possess the strength to carry it.
Right. Nietzsche's essentially saying, yes, freedom is a heavyweight, so stop expecting everyone to be able to lift it. Only the strongest can carry it, and we shouldn't hold them back to make the weak feel better.
He refuses to coddle humanity.
But if we are talking about heavy burdens, we absolutely have to address the other half of this equation, the problem of suffering. Because if you're going to talk about God, meaning, and the human condition, you have to deal with the undeniable reality of pain in the world.
You can't ignore it.
And the brothers Karamazov gives us another character who tackles this head-on, Ivan Karamazov.
Ivan presents arguably one of the most intellectually rigorous and emotionally devastating arguments against the existence of a benevolent God. And what's crucial is that Ivan doesn't argue from a scientific standpoint.
He doesn't care about evolution or physics in this context.
No, he argues from a purely moral standpoint. He catalogs the suffering in the world, focusing specifically on the horrific, unexplainable, and unjustifiable suffering of innocent children.
He tells these gut-wrenching stories of cruelty, things pulled from the actual Russian newspapers of Dostoevsky's time. And then even delivers his ultimate protest.
Right.
He says to his devout brother Alyosha, essentially, if this suffering, if the tears of one tortured child, is the necessary price of admission for some ultimate divine harmony, if this is the foundational ticket to heaven, then I respectfully return my ticket.
It is a total moral rejection of the universe as it is constructed. Ivan is saying that no future paradise can justify the torment of the innocent in the present.
He refuses to accept a God who would build a world on such a brutal foundation.
He isn't saying God doesn't exist. He is saying that if God does exist, his methods are morally unacceptable.
It is such a raw, undeniable human feeling. I think anyone listening to this has felt that at some point.
Yeah.
You see a news story that is just so profoundly unjust, a tragedy so senseless, and you think, how could any higher power, any grand plan, require this?
Ivan gives voice to our deepest outrage.
Now, Nietzsche has a radical counter-argument to this problem of suffering. And I have to admit, it is one of the hardest concepts of his to digest. It's his idea of amor fati, or the love of one's fate.
Amor fati is the ultimate test of the Übermensch. Notice the specific wording Nietzsche uses. He doesn't say you should just accept your fate. He doesn't say you should merely tolerate your suffering or resign yourself to it stoically.
He demands that you actively love it.
Nietzsche challenges us to look at our lives, including the most agonizing suffering, the deepest betrayals, the tragedies, the failures, and say a resounding yes to all of it.
But hold on, let me push back here. How can you realistically ask someone to love the suffering of an innocent child, as Ivan Karamazov points out? Or to bring it to a modern context, let's say someone spends 10 years building a career and it is completely wiped out by an illness or an economic crash.
A lost decade.
Yeah, a lost decade. How do you love a tragedy like that without just being delusional or completely heartless?
That is exactly the friction Nietzsche wants you to feel. Nietzsche would argue that to wish you could surgically remove the tragedy from your past is to reject your entire self.
Because it shapes you.
You are the absolute culmination of every single experience you have had. If you remove the lost decade, if you remove the illness, you remove the person you are right now. Amor fati is the recognition that pain and joy are inextricably linked.
You cannot have the height without the depth.
To love your life is to embrace the whole magnificent, terrible tapestry of it. He isn't asking you to be heartless. He is asking you to be unbreakable. He is demanding that you take that career failure and use it as the raw material to forge a deeper, stronger version of yourself.
So it's about utilizing the pain.
Mm-hmm.
The divergence here is incredibly stark. Dostoevsky sees suffering as the necessary, albeit agonizing, path to spiritual redemption.
When you suffer, it breaks your ego.
It humbles your pride and it opens your heart to empathy. It connects you to the suffering of Christ and the suffering of your fellow man. But Nietzsche views suffering purely as fuel.
There is no divine redemption at the end of it.
And it shouldn't be used to make you humble. It should be used to test your strength, to harden your resolve, and to propel you toward mastery of the self.
Precisely. For Dostoevsky, suffering connects you to the whole of humanity. For Nietzsche, suffering isolates you, but in that glorious isolation, you rise above the mediocrity of the herd.
These are two fundamentally, irreconcilably opposed mechanisms for processing the pain of existence.
And understanding how they view suffering leads us perfectly into the core of their philosophies, the actual engines that drive human life.
Let's look at their two visions of the soul. Yes, let's get down to the absolute bedrock. What is the fundamental driver inside of us? According to Nietzsche, it is the will to power. According to Dostoevsky, the highest ideal is kenotic love.
Let's unpack these, starting with Nietzsche, because the will to power is probably his most misunderstood concept.
A lot of people hear that and immediately think of dictators, political domination, or Wall Street greed.
Right. It has been terribly misappropriated throughout history. For Nietzsche, the will to power is not merely the desire to oppress others or hoard wealth. It is the fundamental underlying biological and psychological drive of all life in the universe.
Drive to expand.
To grow, to overcome resistance, and to assert one's own vitality upon the world. Think of a tree whose roots slowly break through a concrete sidewalk to reach the sunlight. That is the will to power.
Think of an artist agonizing over a canvas, struggling to master their medium and express their inner vision.
That is the will to power. It is the drive to elevate the self, to conquer one's own internal weaknesses, and to shape reality according to one's own will. Nietzsche believed that every single human action, if you trace it down to its root, is an expression of this drive.
So it's this relentless, upward expanding, self-asserting energy. It is the ultimate elevation of the ego. Now contrast that with Dostoevsky's ideal. The term used is kenotic love.
Kenosis is a fascinating word.
It literally means self-emptying. It is the exact polar opposite of self-elevation.
Kenosis is a profound theological concept derived from early Christianity, specifically reflecting the nature of Christ. It refers to the conscious, agonizing act of emptying oneself of ego, of pride, of the desire for dominance.
To make room for divine love and for the deeply empathetic love of others.
Where Nietzsche argues that the highest human achievement is to assert your power and stand above the crowd, Dostoevsky argues that the highest human achievement is to humbly empty yourself out, to serve others, and to willingly bear the burdens and sins of your fellow human beings.
In the Brothers Karamazov, this is embodied by the character of Father Zosima. His teaching is that everyone is responsible for everyone else.
It's not a passive, weak victimhood.
Dostoevsky's version of love is a harsh and dreadful thing in action. It requires a radical, almost terrifying level of forgiveness. It's the difference between a pyramid and a bowl.
Oh, I like that.
Nietzsche wants you to be the pyramid, building a massive base of strength and discipline so you can reach the highest peak, standing alone and magnificent at the top. Dostoevsky wants you to be a bowl, continually emptying yourself of all that self-centered ambition so you can be filled up with something greater and so you can hold the suffering of the world.
That is a very evocative way to picture it. And because they have such diametrically opposed engines driving their worldview, self-assertion versus self-emptying, it completely dictates how they view the origin of morals.
Where do right and wrong actually come from?
This is where Nietzsche drops a bomb on Western civilization with his book on the genealogy of morals. He doesn't just argue against traditional morality, he attempts to expose its history.
He argues that morality is merely a human invention born out of a massive psychological power struggle.
It is a brilliant and deeply cynical psychological analysis. Nietzsche traces the history of concepts like good and evil. He argues that in ancient aristocratic societies, the strong, powerful, noble individuals naturally defined good as whatever reflected their own vitality.
Strength, beauty, conquest, pride.
And bad was simply whatever was weak, sickly, or cowardly. But Nietzsche argues the weak and the powerless who suffered under these masters developed a deep, festering resentment.
And out of this resentment, they enacted a brilliant, subversive psychological revenge. They inverted the values.
The ultimate revenge of the nerds, but on a civilizational scale.
Exactly. The weak convinced the world that their own inescapable traits, weakness, submission, poverty, turning the other cheek, were actually morally good and holy.
And they convinced the world that the traits of their master's strength, pride, dominance, wealth were evil. Nietzsche called this slave morality, and he saw the triumph of Christianity as the ultimate victory of this resentful inversion of natural values.
He is basically saying that traditional morality is a psychological trap invented by the weak to make the strong feel guilty for being strong. It is an incredible disruptive theory.
And Dostoevsky's view could not be further from this.
For Dostoevsky, morality is absolutely not a sociological trick or a byproduct of class warfare. It is absolute. The moral law, the call to love, to forgive, to sacrifice, is woven into the very fabric of reality by God.
To deny it is to deny reality itself.
And this brings us to their ultimate clash over faith. This is Christianity on trial. Nietzsche puts the Christian faith squarely in the crosshairs. He indicts it as a deeply life-denying morality.
He argues that by praising the weak, by focusing entirely on a promised afterlife, and by condemning worldly power and natural human instincts, Christianity has fundamentally sickened humanity.
It keeps us weak, fearful, and terrified of our own immense potential. He sees it as a poison that suppresses the will to power.
But Dostoevsky steps up as the ultimate defense attorney for the faith. He defends Christianity, and specifically the self-sacrificing figure of Christ, as the deepest, most necessary truth about the human soul.
He argues that power, domination, and self-assertion, no matter how glorious they look on the surface, ultimately lead to isolation, violence, and the destruction of the community.
He believes that true healing for the human condition, the only way to avoid tearing each other apart, is through that self-emptying love and spiritual brotherhood.
And if you follow these two philosophers to their logical endpoints, they leave you with two completely different directives for your life. Nietzsche's ultimate demand to the individual is become the creator of your own values.
He is challenging you to reject the herd, to stop relying on inherited beliefs or the promise of heaven.
To face the terrifying abyss of a meaningless universe and to forge your own path, relying entirely on your own strength and aesthetic vision.
While Dostoevsky's plea is the mirror image, become humble before divine truth.
He is warning you that your ego, if left unchecked by the sacred, will eventually destroy you. He is asking you to recognize your own profound brokenness, to bow down before the mystery of faith, and to find your true meaning not through dominating the world, but through loving connection with others.
These are two incredibly powerful, totally incompatible demands, and honestly, it is exhausting just trying to weigh them against each other in the abstract.
But we don't have to look at them in the abstract, because we have the benefit of history. These two thinkers weren't just theorizing in a vacuum, they were reading the trajectory of European civilization.
And that brings us to the prophetic nature of their work. If we look at the 20th century, they truly were prophets of doom.
It is genuinely chilling how accurate they were. Both Dostoevsky and Nietzsche looked at the trajectory of a world rapidly losing its moral and religious foundations, and they predicted absolute catastrophe.
They foresaw that if you remove God, the human desire for an absolute truth doesn't just disappear. It simply finds a new, often far more dangerous target.
Yes, they accurately predicted the rise of nihilism, the devastating, paralyzing belief that nothing matters and everything is meaningless.
But more importantly, they foresaw how that nihilism would be weaponized. They understood that once you remove absolute, transcendent moral truth, society becomes a battleground of sheer will.
Whoever has the most power gets to enforce their reality on everyone else.
They predicted the deadly grip of ideological fanaticism. They knew that people would simply replace religious zealotry with political zealotry, substituting the kingdom of God for the kingdom of man, and attempting to build utopias on earth through force.
And we saw exactly how that played out. Dostoevsky's warnings about the rational utopia, the Crystal Palace, mapped flawlessly onto the horrors of the Soviet Union.
The attempt to engineer a perfect socialist state led directly to the Gulag archipelago.
You had an ideology that believed if you just eliminated the wrong classes of people, you could mathematically ensure paradise. And Nietzsche's concept of the Übermensch and the will to power was tragically and incorrectly misappropriated by fascist movements like the Nazis,
who warped his ideas of internal spiritual mastery into an excuse for racial superiority and military conquest.
The 20th century was a blood-soaked manifestation of the irrational, power-hungry depths of the human mind that both philosophers had warned the Enlightenment thinkers about.
The world wars, the totalitarian regimes, the mass starvation, it all proved that human nature is far darker and far more complex than the optimistic, rationalist thinkers of the 19th century ever wanted to admit.
But the validation of their insights doesn't stop in the 20th century. If we bring the discussion right up to the present day, we find that modern science itself is proving them right in fascinating ways.
This is where the story comes full circle, and I love this part. Remember how both philosophers waged war on the Enlightenment idea of humans as perfectly rational actors making logical decisions?
Well, contemporary research in neuroscience and psychology completely validates their shared hypothesis. Science, the very tool the Enlightenment relied on, has proven the Enlightenment wrong.
It is a profound irony. If you look at modern neuroscience, specifically experiments dating back to Benjamin Libet and continuing today, we know that our brains process emotion, instinct, and subconscious drives milliseconds before the rational prefrontal cortex even gets involved.
We are quite literally wired to feel and react before we think.
Our rational brain is often just acting as a PR representative, inventing logical-sounding reasons for decisions that our subconscious has already made based on primal urges.
Psychologist Jonathan Haidt has a great metaphor for this. He compares the human mind to a rider on an elephant. The rider represents our conscious, rational thought, and the elephant represents our massive, automatic, emotional subconscious.
The writer thinks he's in charge, but whenever there's a disagreement, the elephant always wins.
We are driven by primal instincts, status, tribalism, fear, very much resembling Nietzsche's World of Power and Dostoevsky's Underground Man.
Exactly. And behavioral science has spent the last few decades proving through countless experiments that humans suffer from massive cognitive biases.
We exhibit confirmation bias, ignoring facts that contradict our beliefs.
We experience cognitive dissonance, we actively self-sabotage, we vote against our own economic interests, we are heavily swayed by crowd psychology.
We are exactly as irrational, messy, contradictory, and deeply complex as Dostoevsky and Nietzsche insisted we were.
The very discipline that was supposed to build a sterile, soulless, rational utopia has matured enough to turn the mirror back on us and confirm the dark, complicated psychology that these two thinkers understood intuitively over a century ago.
Which brings us to the end of our deep dive. We have covered a massive amount of ground today. We've gone from the death of God and the collapse of the religious horizon down into the psychological depths of the underground man.
We watched Raskolnikov's morality experiment shatter his soul, and we sat in the cell with the Grand Inquisitor weighing the unbearable burden of freedom.
We explored the relentless drive of the will to power against the radical empathy of kenotic love.
But despite all of this, the scholarly battle continues. Philosophers, psychologists, and theologians are still debating today over who actually understood the ultimate solution to the human condition better.
Was it Nietzsche who saw our terrifying potential to overcome our own humanity and become something greater?
Or was it Dostoevsky, who saw our inherent brokenness and our desperate, inescapable need for grace and connection?
And the reason this debate endures is that it isn't just an academic exercise. It is the ultimate existential choice that remains open to humanity as a whole, and to you personally listening to this right now. You have to look at the world around you with all its chaos and beauty, and look at your own soul and decide.
Do you follow Nietzsche's path? Do you boldly step out into a universe without a safety net, take on the terrifying burden of freedom, embrace your suffering through amor fati, and rely entirely on your own strength to create your own values?
Or do you take Dostoevsky's path? Do you recognize the danger of the unchecked ego, accept that the human conscience cannot survive without an absolute moral anchor, and submit yourself to the difficult, agonizing work of radical love, humility, and spiritual redemption?
Both paths require immense life-altering courage, but they lead in completely opposite directions.
It is a profound, life-defining choice. And as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with a final provocative thought to chew on after the show ends. If modern science proves that we are fundamentally irrational creatures, driven by deep subconscious forces, and if the history of the 20th century proved the absolute dangers of both godless nihilism and forced rational utopias, are we simply trapped?
Are we fundamentally bound by our biology and our dark history to repeat these cycles forever?
Or does the very awareness of our irrationality change the equation? The fact that we can sit here and talk about it, the fact that we can read Dostoevsky and Nietzsche and clearly see ourselves in the mirror they hold up, does that very awareness grant us a new kind of agency?
Does understanding the trap give us the power to step out of it?
You know what the stakes are now. You've seen the arguments, the history, and the psychology. So with this awareness, which way do you step? Do you choose the abyss or do you choose the Uberbench? Think about it. We will see you next time.